In the year 619, in the burning noon of Mecca, a man lay stripped on the desert sand. He was an Ethiopian slave. His name was Bilal ibn Rabah. His master was torturing him to death. On Bilal's bare chest, his master had placed an enormous stone. The sun above was at its peak. Every few minutes, the master would lean down and ask the same question. Renounce this new religion. Renounce Muhammad. Worship the gods of our fathers again, and I will free you from this torment. And every time he was asked, the slave on the sand answered with the same two words. Ahad. Ahad. One. One. The slave on the sand was speaking the name of the one God. 12 years later, that same Ethiopian slave would climb onto the roof of the Kaaba itself. He would stand on the holiest building in Mecca and give the first ever public call to prayer. The city that had once tortured him would hear his voice carrying across its rooftops. This is the story of Bilal ibn Rabah, the slave who became the first Muezzin of Islam, a man whose voice the entire Muslim world echoes 5 times a day, more than 14 centuries later. A man the Prophet Muhammad called his beloved, and whose body lies in a tomb in Damascus. It is the story of how Islam, in its very first generation, lifted a slave into a man of God. I'm Brother Idris, and welcome to the archive, where forgotten history lives again. To understand the man on the burning sand, you have to begin with the Mecca of his time. Mecca, in the early 7th century, was a small trading city in the western Arabian Peninsula. It was ruled by an aristocracy of clans who controlled the trade caravans, the wells, and the Kaaba. The Kaaba, in pre-Islamic times, was already an ancient sanctuary, filled with 360 idols. Each Arabian tribe had its own god represented inside. Pilgrims came each year to circle the building. Mecca's economy depended on this pilgrimage. The aristocracy enforced the system through political power. At the bottom of this society were the slaves, mostly Ethiopians and Africans brought across the Red Sea. They did not own themselves. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed at the will of their masters. Bilal ibn Rabah was born into this world, probably around the year 580. His mother's name was Hamama, and most early sources say she was an Ethiopian woman. His father, Rabah, was also a slave. By some traditions, his mother's lineage went back to Abyssinian nobility. But by the time Bilal was born, the family was deep in the slavery of the Quraysh aristocracy. Bilal was sold as a young man to a wealthy Meccan named Umayya ibn Khalaf. Umayya was the head of the clan Banu Jumma. He was wealthy and a fierce defender of the old gods. And then, in or around the year 610, something began in the city. A merchant from one of the lesser branches of Quraysh began to preach a new doctrine. His name was Muhammad ibn Abdullah. He was about 40 years old when he began to speak publicly. He taught that the 360 idols of the Kaaba were false, that there was only one God, the same God the Jewish and Christian prophets had served, and that this God demanded compassion, almsgiving, and an end to the exploitation of the weak. The Meccan aristocracy heard this teaching and recognized what it meant for their economic and social order. If the idols were destroyed, the pilgrimage would collapse. If the weak were equal, slavery itself was on trial. So they responded with violence. Rich converts could be ignored. Slaves who joined the new religion could not. Bilal ibn Rabah, slave of Umayya, was one of the first to declare his faith in this new religion. Historians believe he was perhaps the 7th person to publicly accept Islam in its earliest months.
Some sources place him among the first 6.
The very earliest community of believers in the city. His conversion did not stay secret for long. Umayya discovered it and saw it as a personal humiliation. His slave, his property, was refusing to honor the gods of his master's house. Umayya decided to break him, publicly, slowly, in front of the entire city. Every day, by the surviving accounts of Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, the torture was repeated. Umayya would have Bilal dragged out to the open desert or to a courtyard at noon. Bilal would be stripped, his body pinned to the burning sand under the highest sun. Then a heavy boulder would be placed on his chest. Some accounts describe several stones. The weight made breathing nearly impossible. The heat of the sand seared the skin against the bone. Umayya would lean over him with the same demand: renounce Muhammad, return to the old gods. And Bilal, lying half-conscious under the stone, would answer with the same word over and over: Ahad.
Ahad. 1. 1.
He spoke the name of the one God under the weight of the stone. This single syllable became one of the most cited expressions of devotion in early Islamic memory. Bilal was almost killed. He was beaten unconscious more than once, yet he never yielded. And then, one afternoon, a wealthy merchant of Quraysh happened to walk past the scene. His name was Abu Bakr. He had been one of the first to accept Muhammad's teaching. Abu Bakr saw the broken slave under the stone. He turned to Umayya and made an offer. He named a price for Bilal in gold coins. The exact amount differs from source to source. Umayya accepted, mocking. He believed the slave would die anyway from his injuries. Abu Bakr paid the price. He had Bilal carried home and tended back to health. And then he did the one thing Umayya had not expected. He freed Bilal completely. For the first time in his life, Bilal ibn Rabah was a free man. This was, in early Islamic tradition, one of the great acts of Abu Bakr's life. Centuries later, Sufis would still say that the breath of Abu Bakr breathed life back into Bilal. From that day, Bilal attached himself to the household of the Prophet Muhammad himself. He became one of the inner circle of companions, known for his tall, lean frame. He was known for his dark skin, dignified bearing, and for a voice that carried great distance. The early sources describe his voice as deep, melodious, and unusually powerful even at a low volume. In the year 622, the Muslims fled Mecca for the city of Medina. Bilal went with them. This migration, the Hijra, became the starting point of the Islamic calendar. In Medina, a small community organized itself around the Prophet, with a simple mosque and house. And a question came up almost immediately. How would the community know when to gather for prayer? The Jewish community in Medina blew a ram's horn. The Christians used a wooden clapper or bell. The Prophet wanted something different, something that would carry, that would be uniquely Muslim. According to the traditional account preserved by Ibn Ishaq, the solution came in a dream. A companion named Abdullah ibn Zayd dreamed that a man in green robes taught him a formula of words. Allahu Akbar, God is greatest. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah, I bear witness there is no God but God. He brought the words to the Prophet. The future Caliph Umar reported the same dream the next day. The Prophet recognized the call as a true revelation, but he made one immediate decision about it. Abdullah ibn Zayd should not be the one to recite it. Bilal had the better voice. Indeed, Bilal has a louder and more beautiful voice than yours, the Prophet said. Bilal was instructed to climb to the highest point near the mosque and pronounce the words. And so, for the first time in the history of Islam, the call to prayer rang out. It was the voice of an Ethiopian former slave,
calling the worshippers to bow before the one God. The institution of the Muezzin had been founded. It has not changed in its essentials for 14 centuries. From that point on, Bilal called the Muslims to every one of the 5 daily prayers. He stood at the door of the Prophet's house before dawn each day and recited the call. His voice, in the early biographies, became the soundtrack of the Medinan community. Through every battle, every campaign, every diplomatic moment, Bilal was at the Prophet's side. In the year 624, the Meccan polytheists marched against the Muslims at Badr. It was the first major battle of Islamic history. 300 Muslims faced about 1,000 Quraysh. Among the leaders of the Meccan army was Umayya ibn Khalaf, the same Umayya who had tortured Bilal. During the battle, according to the major Sirah sources, the 2 men met on the field. Umayya was captured by another Muslim. Bilal, seeing his former master, called out across the battlefield. "The chief of unbelief," he shouted, "Umayya ibn Khalaf. If he survives, I do not survive." The Muslims around him closed in. By the surviving accounts, Bilal himself led the strike that finished Umayya. It was a moment heavy with meaning. The slave had stood over his former master. The man who had been broken on the sand had broken the man who broke him. After Badr, Bilal continued in every campaign, at Uhud, at the Trench, and in every march beyond. In the year 630, the Muslims returned to Mecca in force. The Quraysh, knowing they could not resist, surrendered the city almost without fighting. Muhammad entered the city of his birth at the head of an army of believers. He went straight to the Kaaba. He had the 360 idols removed and destroyed. He pardoned almost everyone who had once driven him out of the city. And then, with the noon prayer approaching, the Prophet did something deliberate and symbolic. He turned to Bilal. He said, "Climb onto the roof of the Kaaba, call the prayer." Bilal climbed onto the holiest building in Arabia. He stood on its flat roof above the crowd. And the Ethiopian former slave gave the call to prayer over the very city that had tortured him. The Quraysh who watched recognized what they were seeing. Some wept openly in the streets. Others muttered in private that they could not believe a black slave stood on their sacred building. When the Prophet was told about the muttering, his answer was preserved in the Hadith collections. There is no preference for an Arab over a non-Arab, except in piety. This statement, made in connection with Bilal, became a founding principle of Islamic universalism. Race, color, language, status, none of these gave any human being precedence in the religion. 2 years later, in the year 632, the Prophet Muhammad died in Medina. He died in the arms of his youngest wife, Aisha, the daughter of Abu Bakr. Bilal was in the house when it happened. He had been the Muezzin for over a decade by then. On the morning of the burial, it was time for the dawn prayer. Abu Bakr, now the first caliph, called Bilal to come and perform the adhan. Bilal climbed to his usual position. He began the call as he had for 14 years. But when he reached the phrase, "I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God," he could not finish. He broke down on the platform. He could not speak. The Muslims gathered below began to weep. Bilal climbed down. He told Abu Bakr that he could never recite the adhan in Medina again. The voice that had named the Prophet for 14 years could not name him in his absence. Soon after the funeral, Bilal asked Abu Bakr for permission to leave Medina entirely. He joined the Muslim armies moving north into Syria. He volunteered for service in the military campaigns. He became a soldier of the conquering forces, no longer a man of the mosque. He settled eventually in the city of Damascus, where a growing Muslim community had begun to take root. For several years, Bilal lived there quietly. He never recited the call to prayer again.
But in the year 638, an event drew him out one last time. Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab marched on Jerusalem and accepted the surrender of the Patriarch Sophronius. It was the first time the holy city had passed under Muslim rule. Umar entered Jerusalem on foot, wearing the simple robe of an ascetic, while his servant rode the camel. He went to the site of the ancient Jewish temple, the Temple Mount, and ordered the area cleansed. And then the older Sahaba, who had known the Prophet personally, gathered around the Caliph. They had a single request.
Ask Bilal to give the adhan one more time here in Jerusalem. Bilal had been sent for from Damascus. He was now an elderly man with white hair. He had not recited the call in years. He resisted the request at first, saying the pain was too much. But the Sahaba pressed him. They said the Prophet himself would have wanted to hear his voice again. And so, on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in the year 638, Bilal climbed up. He turned toward Mecca. He raised his hands as he had thousands of times before in his life, and he gave the call to prayer for the very last time in his life. According to the eyewitness Sahaba, the entire gathering of veterans began to weep openly in the square. They remembered the rooftop of the Kaaba. They remembered the dawn prayers in Medina. They remembered the man whose voice had carried the prayer through every battle of the early religion. Bilal returned to Damascus after the conquest of Jerusalem. He did not recite the adhan again. In the year 640, he became seriously ill in his home in Damascus. He was about 60 years old, an unusually long life for that period in Arabia. His wife sat beside him as he was dying. She wept and said, "Oh, what a sorrow." According to the tradition recorded by Ibn Sa'd in his Tabaqat, Bilal answered with his last words, "What a joy! Tomorrow I meet my beloved, Muhammad and his companions in paradise." He died that night. He was buried in the Bab al-Sagir cemetery on the southern wall of Damascus. His tomb is still visible there, 14 centuries later, a small shrine within an ancient wall. Today, every 5 times a day, more than 2 billion Muslims hear the same call Bilal first proclaimed. From the minarets of Java to the mosques of California, the words have not changed. The form Bilal recited in Medina is the form recited everywhere the religion has ever spread. And in early Islamic memory, that form is forever attached to a man who had been a slave. The Prophet's words, that piety, not blood or color, makes one human equal another, found their first witness in Bilal, a slave on the burning sand who would not deny the one God. Today the call still rings out from Damascus, from Cairo, from Lahore, from Istanbul, from Mecca itself. And somewhere along the southern wall of Damascus, a small tomb still marks the grave of the man. His voice has never stopped. It still echoes from every minaret in the world. I'm Brother Idris, and the archive remains open.